Let's start in thinking about arguments. After you get past part 1, these guys are engaged in heavy-duty arguments about the existence and the nature of God. And it goes on pretty well until part 11, and at the end of part 11, Demea gets irritated and says, I've had it with you guys, I'm leaving, and then they sort of wrap things up. So we're going to look at what's going on mainly from part 2 and 3 all the way to 11. We're going to try to get through as much of it as possible. I've sort of laid out a plan over here. If we don't get to all of it, that's okay. Before we do that, some sort of general remarks. So I think you guys have gotten this from not just this class, but other classes that you're taking, like your writing classes, for example, that you're required to make arguments in, make a case for something, we often say, tell me why you think this. That's asking you to make an argument. And when you're making an argument, you're giving some sort of premises, some sort of starting points, and you want these to be things that aren't just ideas that you have. You want these to be things that your audience can agree about. Otherwise, you're never going to get going, right? If you start out with a premise like, I am the greatest person in the world. Now, any particular person who says that, do the people around them believe that? Probably not, right? So you're not going to get off the ground with some argument like, I am the greatest person in the world, the greatest person deserves everything, that coffee over there is part of everything, give me that coffee. That's not going to fly. That's an argument, but rhetorically it's a terrible argument, because you're not going to get anybody to accept that conclusion. They might actually be willing to give you the coffee if you just ask them nicely. You don't need an argument for that, right? When we want to convince people of things that we believe and they don't believe, we start looking for grounds that we can use that they do believe, that they do accept, or they're willing to at least accept for a while, see where they're going with it. And then we want to bring them to this conclusion. That's the way these arguments are going. And the conclusion in these arguments typically is something like, God exists. There we're talking about whether God exists or not, the existence of God, the being of God. And philosophical arguments about God quite often bear on, is there God at all? Is there any such thing? Hume is a bit more interested in this question. What sort of God are you talking about? That's what a lot of the discussion in the course of these arguments bears on. Are you talking about a God who's some first cause, but about whom we can't know very much, like Demea thinks? Are you talking about a God who's a designer, and perhaps not as infinite or perfect or anything like that, you know, the traditional conceptions of God, the way Cleanthes thinks? Or could God be a gigantic spider spinning the cosmos out of some sort of web, you know, the way that Philo proposes? Or perhaps as he calls a superannuated deity, that means senile. Senile deity who created the world, you know, as sort of a last effort and then died off. You know, it matters an awful lot the way you actually think about God. And when people get into these arguments and they want to convince other people that God exists, or they want to convince people that God doesn't exist, something that often gets left out of the picture is, well, what exactly do you mean by this? Are your arguments leading towards the same conception of God that we're interested in? You know, if, for example, let's say you're arguing against God. This is not an argument that Hume makes. Sometimes people will argue that God can't possibly exist because human beings clearly have some sort of need or investment in thinking that there's a God. So therefore, you know, most things that we have a need or investment in thinking about don't actually exist. You know, they don't exist the way that we think that they do. They're certainly not necessary. There's a lot of wish fulfillment, right? This is Freud's conception, among other people. Now, if you actually look at the kind of, you know, ideas of God that people like that put forward, it tends to be the God who gives us everything we want. Is that all there is to traditional conceptions of God? Is it the God of, God, won't you give me a Mercedes-Benz? The old, is that Joan Baez song? You guys heard that song before? The whole song, it's kind of a spoof. It's this woman who's praying, and she says, God, won't you give me a Mercedes-Benz? And she's got some sort of explanation for why she needs it. And then House on a Hill. And I don't even remember what else is in the song. There's a few other things. Now, is God like the big cosmic dispenser, the social worker, the welfare provider? You just got to go and hand in the right form and say, here you go, can I have the stuff now? That's a conception of God that some people do have, right? Now, if somebody's arguing against that conception of God, and you don't believe that God is like that, and you actually say that's a really bad conception of God, if you see things that way, you're kind of an idolater. Is their argument really taking any hold against your conception of God? No. They're arguing against something that they imagine religious people believe in. But a lot of religious people don't. You notice, looking at Cleanthes and Demea, religious people can have very different conceptions of what God is like. So, we want to be clear about what kind of God we're talking about, and the existence of God and the nature or attributes or essence of God are going to be somewhat different from each other when we're looking at this. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing I want to do, a little bit of review, because these terms are going to get used so much. You remember last class we talked about a priori, right, and a posteriori. And we didn't really talk about these earlier in the semester, though we could have. It becomes necessary because Hume uses these terms so much in the course of the discussion. So, what is a priori? Do you guys remember what that comes from? It's Latin. The a is from, or by, or with. You remember what the
logic?
Well, yeah, logic is something that falls under the a priori. Yeah. Reasoning. Although reasoning can be done a posteriori as well. When you see that word there, yeah.
Is everything that comes from experience?
That would be a posteriori, yeah.
Based solely on reasoning?
Yeah, it's based solely on reasoning. It comes before, right? That's the prior. You see the priori in there? Posterior means after. And why would it be based solely on reasoning? Because coming after experience, coming before experience. So you don't need any experience of something to make an a priori argument. That's why logic, mathematics would fit under that. For instance, none of you have been to Somalia, right? If you haven't, I'll pick somewhere else. What do we know about Somalia? What's that?
Pirates.
There's pirates, okay. Now we're on to something. What do pirates do? Loot, okay. So you haven't been to Somalia. You don't actually have any experience of Somalis or actually probably even pirates, right? Has any of you run across a pirate? You've seen like movies and things like that. And let's see, how would we make this work? Is it good to loot people? No. Okay. So now there's a lot of assumptions being made here, but just go with me on this. So we've got, Somalia is full of pirates. Pirates loot people. Looting people is a bad thing. Therefore, Somalia is full of bad people. That would be an a priori argument. We're not worried about, at this point, whether it's true or false, good, bad, anything like that. I'm just using this to get across the point. Notice, we haven't actually experienced anything. If we actually went to Somalia and we start looking around, so are you a pirate? No, I'm not a pirate. Are you a pirate? Maybe our premises are bad. Now we're actually starting to appeal to experience. We can make all sorts of arguments based on appeals to experience. If you pull the dog's tail, what's probably going to happen to you? Dog's going to bite you, yeah, unless it's a really nice dog. How do you know this? I'm willing to bet some of you pull dogs' tails. Did you? Or you watched another kid pull the dog's tail, and the dog turned around and bit him, and you're like, I told you, don't pull his tail. You know, you have experience about that sort of thing. Again, it's kind of a silly example, but you see, that would be an a posteriori argument. And when you tell your child, now little Johnny, Fluffy doesn't like it when you pull his tail, and he will bite you. And Johnny says, I don't believe you. He says, look, I've seen a lot of kids get bit when they pull the tail. Fluffy is a dog. Dogs don't like that. But go ahead and try it. And he pulls the tail and gets bit. I told you so. I made an a posteriori argument to you, you know, on the basis of good experience. It was not a certain argument. You might not get bit this time, but I was pretty reasonably sure that you were going to get bit. That was the conclusion of my argument. So you see the difference between these. Now, why is Hume so interested in this? Well, let's think about what we're making arguments on. Are we arguing about pirates or dogs and tails or things like that, light bulbs, shirts, desks, things in the world? To a certain degree. But what are we trying to get at with these arguments in this dialogue?
Nature of God.
The nature of God, yeah. Now, when we talk about God, why is it that we have so many different conceptions of God, and those conceptions tend to be kind of hard to get our heads around, fuzzy? God isn't like a cup of coffee where, you know, somebody says, hey, you need to try some God. This is really good God. Yeah, that's filling me up. It's just what I needed inside. Now my life is all on the right track. It doesn't quite work like that, does it?
No, it's because everybody, or I can't say everybody, but people see God as the miracle worker, something that we can't do, He can do for us.
Ah, yeah, there's an issue too. God or the gods, however you conceive of the divine, are seen as being in some way transcendent, having powers beyond the kind of powers that we have or understand. This is often called the God of the gaps sort of notion that, well, we can't explain something, so God did it. You know, a miracle happened. And that's sort of a lack of intelligibility used to explain a lack of intelligibility rather than actually filling anything in, until we actually know something about the nature of God. So God is transcendent in power to our experience. If God created the universe, that's a pretty big thing. We understand creation of, you know, like, you could probably figure out how this chalk was made, right? Every one of you? Where did it come from, the materials for it? You guys know? What's that? Chalk.
Chalk.
Yeah, not. If it was chocolate, you're right, cocoa plant. But chalk, what is this made out of? Calcium carbonate, which is, it's kind of stone. Limestone, very good. And now this doesn't look like limestone, so what did they have to do? They must have ground it up and they, you know, kind of swished it in. And I don't really know much more about that, but I think the rest of you probably have some idea about how it got round like that and straight. How would they do that?
Form.
Some sort of form and press, and they do it mass production. Okay, so you understand that pretty well. Notice it's something you haven't been to their chalk factory, have you? Did any of you take a field trip? No, you figured it out, right? Because things in the world we're able to understand pretty well on the basis of our experience, and even if we don't have a lot of experience, we might be able to do some reasoning about it. Something that created the whole universe, that's a whole different ballgame, isn't it? That's a little harder to make sense of. You know, God is supposed to be ultimately good, perfect. Do we experience that in our ordinary existence? Do you know anybody who's perfectly good? Probably know some people that are really good. I hope you do, because your life is enriched by that. But I don't think we know anybody who's perfectly good. God is supposed to be perfectly good. This is hard stuff to make sense out of. So if we're going to make arguments, and we want to base them on experience, we want to make arguments a posteriori, we got to worry about how representative is my experience. how much can I extrapolate from the little bit that I've experienced, or even all my friends and colleagues and coworkers have experienced, all the way to some sort of transcendent being, who I can't actually go and say get into outer space and look around. Oh, there's God. That's not going to work. I can't verify it on the basis of experience like that. When it comes to a priori arguments, Hume is very suspicious of those too, because he says, and this isn't the only position you could take on this, he says any sort of arguments that are not based in experience, and you're just thinking about how things have to be connected together, what he calls connections of ideas, those could be different. You could imagine them different than they are. Think about the world that we currently live in. There are certain laws of nature, certain processes that take place all the time, right? Could they be different than they are? Can you conceive of them as being different than they are? If you can conceive of them as being different, Hume says, then there's a possibility, it's possible that they could be different, even though they aren't. And that means that they're not necessary, which means you're not going to be able to really reason from them a priori with any sort of certainty. And you could, come up with any sort of argument you like for whatever you like, and that means you're not going to really get anywhere. Now, in this dialogue, Demea is saying, hey, we want these kind of proofs, and Cleanthes is saying, we want these kind of proofs, and Philo is criticizing both of them, and both of those guys are also criticizing each other. So now what we want to do after all this is look at some of these arguments and see how they get put together, how they stack up. So let's think first of all, just to get these out of the way, about these a priori arguments made by this guy Demea. And Demea is sort of in many respects, a traditional theologian. He likes the idea of a priori arguments, arguments that you can come up with on the basis of reason alone, because those ought to be convincing no matter what your experience is. So in traditional apologetics, which is giving arguments for doctrines of the faith, you see a lot of people still these days making these arguments. There'll be like a conversation in a coffee shop between a Christian and his atheist friend, and the atheist will say, I just don't believe in God, and the Christian will say, well, consider all these things around you. All of them have a cause, don't they? The atheist says, yeah, they all have a cause. Well, what caused them? Well, they're made out of matter, or somebody made them this way, or there's some sort of, purpose behind making, the coffee cup and all that, or evolution, or pick whatever you like. And then, the Christian will ask another question. He'll say, okay, that's fine. You've identified causes that lead to effects. Now what caused that cause? And then the atheist will think a little bit more and say, well, the laws of nature. Okay, what caused that? And you can keep on pushing it back further and further and further, right? Now, you're not relying on experience to do that. You may rely on experience at the very start of this. This is what we call a cosmological argument, or an argument from what we call causality. Demea's point is this. So you have effects, and what do effects come from? Causes. But a cause itself is generally an effect of some other cause. Right? And that can be an effect of what? Just popped into existence randomly? Does that make sense? It just is that way. Well, when you come to that, it just is that way. That sort of undermines our desire for intelligibility, for making sense out of things. And, Demea wants to say that we actually can understand, at least that there has to be some sort of ultimate cause. What do you think he calls that ultimate cause? The Big Bang? The Big Bang would have to be explained, wouldn't it? You're not going to get very far by just saying, well, a Big Bang happened. Why did it happen? Well, matter has its own internal laws and rules and things that it goes by. Really? How'd those get there? You can keep on pushing it back. Sooner or later, you have to arrive at something that you're willing to say, okay, here's the bedrock. This is what got the whole thing going. There's some sort of ultimate cause, something at the very end of this chain that makes things the way they are. There's also a further problem, too, that Demea points out, too. Not only do you have to have some sort of ultimate cause, you also have to explain how this whole chain itself works. I mean, is there some reason why these causes are arranged in the order that they are in relation to each other? What brought that about? There has to be, what he's looking for is some sort of, let's put the word here, necessity. I'll misspell necessity. Some sort of necessary being. Now, we're not necessary beings, right? You didn't have to exist the way that you do. If your parents hadn't gotten together, then you wouldn't be who you are. If let's say, pick whoever, you're I don't know how your mom and dad met, but presumably they liked each other, and you know what happens after that, and then there you are. What if they'd like somebody else instead? I said, I don't want to have a child with this person, rather have a child with this person. There wouldn't be any you. It's not like there'd be a different you. There wouldn't be any you, right? It's not like you'd have, dark hair, right? And he'd have blonde hair or something like that. There wouldn't be any him. There wouldn't be any you. There'd be other things instead. What about, even if we trace it all the way back to the Big Bang? Well, what if the Big Bang never happened? Then you don't get anything going on. And you can have things like the Big Bang or evolution, or pick whatever sort of scientific explanations you like in here, but Demea would say, that's fine, you got to explain how those themselves get rolling and why they work the way that they do. Now, Cleanthes and Philo both say, this isn't going to wash. Why? When you look at this sort of reasoning, do you find this convincing yourself? There has to be some sort of cause, because otherwise you couldn't get the whole thing going in the first place. Do you find it convincing, or do you find it unconvincing? Yeah.
It could be a bit lacking, because what if you found a different cause besides God to start everything in motion?
Okay. Couldn't you push the question further back and say, well, what caused that cause? I mean, at least with God, you can say, well, by assumption, he's the beginning of everything. He's the unmoved mover. Let's say it was aliens, right? People want to say sometimes aliens created the whole cosmos that we know about. Some sort of super powerful race. That's fine. Where'd they come from? See, the reason why this kind of argument gets made over and over again is not just because people are, desperate to find, some sort of way to prove that God exists. It's because there is some sort of, there is something within the nature of the way that we look at the world, where we're always able to ask a why afterwards, and we're not completely happy until we get a final why. Yeah.
Can't you just say everything was up to chance?
Up to chance? Yeah, I mean, that's one way you could go. And if you're going to be totally committed to that, I guess that would get you out of the problem. The trouble is, once you do that, it would sort of like reverberate forward, and then everything is totally random. Isn't it? Is that our experience, though? I don't think so. Hume doesn't really worry that much about that. He says, look, these arguments from a priori bases, they just don't work. You can imagine things to be different. And if you can imagine them to be different, then you haven't proved anything with necessity. You know, there's another problem with this too. Let's say you actually do go through all of this, and you get God as being a necessary cause. Is that the kind of notion of God that most religious people have? Is that a God who brought miracles? Is there a God doing miracles in this business? Probably not. Right? I mean, if you set everything up well enough, you don't need miracles. But when you think about God, and you think about whether you want to believe in God or not, do you think, yes, I need to decide whether there's a necessary cause to everything that exists, and the whole basis of causality? Is that how you frame it to yourself? When those of you who go to church, or or synagogue, or wherever, temple, do you say to yourself, all right, now I'm going to pray to the necessary being, the ultimate cause of things? Open up the hymnal to page 36. Oh, necessary being, we praise thee. Is that how it goes? That's not a very rich conception of God. Maybe that's not even the same conception of God that religious people actually have. So that's a problem right there. And Demea is not going to really play much more role other than picking at the arguments that the other two guys are making. So let's look at the argument that Hume devotes much more room to. A posteriori. Posteriori arguments. And the argument that he focuses on is design. And this is an argument by analogy. And we talked about this last time. An example of an analogy is dog is to cat as puppy is to kitten, right? Not goldfish, not sassafras tree, kitten. You got to have the right thing to fill in that spot. You guys did lots of these when you took your SATs or your ACTs or all the other tests that they constantly give you guys. Can we make analogies between other things? Well, let's think about the structure of analogy first. Whenever you're making an argument from analogy, you're saying that you have two things. Let's call them A and X. And you want to say A and X share some sort of common property. So, how do you get there? It's not just enough to say, well, human beings design things, therefore God designs things, therefore God exists. You need some other terms. And there may be more of these. So you're saying that because the relationship between these is similar, and these things themselves are similar, that you can go from this to this. This is the thing that you don't actually know. This is the thing you don't have experience of, per se. You have experience over here, plenty in your life. So, and you may have some experience of this as well. This is what you want to find out about. So if we're working with this design argument, here's basically the way it goes. When we look at, I'm going to erase some of this stuff now, so we have a little bit of a cleaner board. We have human beings. We'll call it human designer. And, to make it contemporary, let's use an iPhone, right? So Those of you that have, other smartphones, just sub in whatever you like, right? And 20 years from now, and who knows what we're going to actually have, we could just sub in some other piece of technology. And if this were earlier, you could pick something like a mill, grinding wheat. Yeah, thanks. I was going to say coffee, but who makes a mill to grind coffee? Wheat is much more common. Or you can pick anything that you like. We didn't have these sort of things back in my time. We were lucky that we had the old Ataris. Everything was very highly pixelated. And we thought that was like, magic. But somebody designed that, right? And, your great-grandparents' generation, my grandparents' generation, they thought the TV was just amazing stuff. We sort of just take it for granted, right? And your kids are going to look at the technology that you have and be like, wow, I can't believe people actually used that sort of thing back in the day. I wish mom and dad would shut up about, all this stuff that they did that was, so cool back then, because we all know it's just, run of the mill. And why do we have that? We have experience of designing things. And you guys have designed some things, right? You've probably taken some things apart and made modifications to them. Even just, let's think about your phones. How did you customize the phone to be what it is that you wanted it to be? How do we do that sort of thing? We don't generally take it apart because that violates the warranty, and we don't know enough, unless maybe some of you do. We don't know enough about these things to actually work on them without damaging them. But what do you do with your phone? Yeah.
Maybe like a case on it, different like backgrounds and stuff.
Yeah, so the case is external, but the background itself, you're monkeying around with the phone. So maybe it's your dog or a place that you've been. I've got my wife's picture, as the background picture. At least the one that comes up at first, and then I've got a concert scene for another one. But you can't see the background picture, and why not? What do we have in our phones?
Locks.
What's that?
Locks.
Well, let's say it's unlocked. Apps, right. Now, who put those apps on your phone? You did, right? Apple put some of the things on your iPhone. How does it work with Android? Anybody here have an Android phone? Does it come with no apps at all?
No, it comes with a few.
Okay, so even with Android, super open source, totally up to you. They say, well, everything's up to you except for this bit right here that we're going to put in. But the rest of it we add in. What else do you put on your phone?
Ringtones.
Ringtones, yeah, you customize those. What else? Somebody else had some, yeah.
Music.
Lots of music. I know that takes up most of the space on my phone. And there's this other category that you can never quite figure out what it is. It sucks up memory. And none of the forums ever have a conclusive thing about that. Now, you have experience of modifying these sort of things. How many of you built forts when you were kids? Or at least snow forts? Or pillow forts? You ever built pillow forts with a couch and stuff like that? You were a designer, right? Did any of you take things apart, like your toaster, or you fixed your bike, or things like that? Now you can tell you're a good designer or a bad designer whether you have all the parts are gone when you're done putting it back together, or whether you have what in mechanics we call spare parts, which aren't really spare parts because they're supposed to be in the thing, but you didn't know where they went back in. But you have a lot of experience in this, right? When you take your car to the mechanic, used to be you could actually work on your own cars quite a bit. Nowadays you can't do that very much. The mechanics hook it up to computers, and then they figure out what's wrong with it, and then they charge you, a good bit of money. Why are they getting that money? Because they're a designer. They know how to fix that sort of thing. Now, what would the B over here be? Let's get rid of the iPhone thing now. Let's just say products of human. Hume uses the word art. Let's say technology. That's easier to relate to, right? Because when we think art, we think of like going downtown and looking at the museum and standing and looking at a painting or at some weird, incomprehensible sculpture and, what's the meaning of it? He's not talking about art in that sense. He's talking about technology. What would be the B over here? If we want to get to, ultimately, God, what are we looking for? We know God didn't make the iPhone. We know that we did. Yeah.
The cause of it?
Cause of the iPhone? Well, we know what the cause of the iPhone is. Apple, Steve Jobs. You know, the mighty Steve Jobs waved his wand and the iPhone came into existence. No? Yeah.
Everything in existence?
Yeah. There's two ways we can go with this. We can, over here, with the B part, we can say that it is the entire universe. Or we can go a little bit smaller scale and we can talk about non-tech things. And what would that include? Minerals, you know. The mineral kingdom is kind of interesting. Any of you have an interest in geology or earth science? It's kind of cool stuff. Not really that complicated. Those of you that we were talking about this before, a couple class sessions before class, when you get away from physics itself and get into chemistry, and then you get to something else that's a little bit more complicated. What was it? The subject matter? Where you're dealing with life. What is the science that studies living things? Biology, right? Biology's got to be more complicated than chemistry or physics because you're dealing with higher level principles. You're dealing with much more organized things. Now, just think about, remember back in high school or middle school, looking at single-celled organisms? If you have a really good microscope, first you got to figure out how to use the microscope, right? Your eyelashes get in the way and all. Doesn't work quite right. But if you actually get it to work right and you can see the single-celled organism and you start to see the structure inside of it, isn't that fascinating? It's got so much structure in there. It's like a little machine, Hume says. This is a very popular view of things. And if you think of these things as being like machines, it makes them very easy to think about and manipulate and conceptualize and make predictions about. And bacteria are very much like little machines. If you go even further down, like viruses, all viruses is code inside of a protein container, and that code goes out, it gets injected into a cell, and it inserts itself into the cell's DNA, and then it takes over the DNA and it makes it make more viruses. And that's what makes you sick, because your cells actually explode and shoot out all sorts of viruses. That's just purely a machine, an organic machine. But maybe, we saw this with Descartes, maybe animals and plants are machines as well. Maybe your body is just an incredibly complicated machine. Now, can we make stuff like that other than in sci-fi movies?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, they have, it's on Google Tech about 2 months ago where they made a robot with the exact same motions.
Right, that's technology. I'm talking about actually, can we make living tissue, with the sort of complexity? I know we've created like meat in the laboratory, but it's not really meat. It's kind of a meaty kind of like thing. Yeah.
Well, they have actually repurposed viruses for other goals.
Yes, we're able to monkey around with the stuff and change its programming, so to speak. I mean, we do that with genetic things, like, we do that all the time with agricultural things. Right? We want the corn not to be affected by a particular bug, so the corn grows a poison. We put in a gene, and the corn develops a poison to that bug. But that doesn't mean that we actually designed the thing itself. We just found it, and then it's sort of like you coming across an iPhone in the bathroom, and it doesn't have a lock. Or let's say it has a lock on it. You figure out the lock, and you say, "Well, I don't like this app. I'm going to get rid of this app and add this one instead." I don't like their pictures. I'll put my own pictures in. Their music is awful. I'll put my own music in, and change the name on the phone too. I'll change the number, so that I don't have, there are people calling me all the time. The iPhone itself still exists, though, right? And it still has the same basic structure, coding, all that. You just messed around with the surface level of it. Yeah.
So what about cloning then?
Cloning would be taking something that already exists out there and making more of it, using this sort of logic. Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to a point eventually where some of these arguments about, God being so much of a greater designer might get more implausible because of our capacities. If we go back to like Hume's time, this stuff was just like complete science fiction. I mean, you could look at like a human being and you could cut them open and say, wow, complicated structure. We're not able to do that. And then this would be more plausible, yeah.
So the only terms of where technology could do on par to, say, just creating actual organism is if using no biological means, like, say, taking from an already existing cell, just purely from elements you created life?
Yeah, and if you wanted to go further with it, I guess, imagine trying to create an animal that has never existed before from the ground up, with like everything that an animal has to have, the whole nervous system, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, all these complicated things, and with no blueprint whatsoever.
Start small and work with a single cell first?
Yeah, that'd probably be the way to go, yeah.
But like, can't we view our technology as being like alive in a certain sense?
That's an interesting question. That's one that Hume doesn't consider. But we can start to worry about that once it starts getting particularly complicated. And that's why we have some sci-fi things where, like, the machines become sentient, and then once they do, generally once the machines become sentient, we're in trouble, right? Because then they're not happy about the fact that we've enslaved them, and they start killing us, and Skynet takes over, the Matrix takes over. Those are really interesting questions. Let me get back to this, because I want to plow through this argument thing. So the idea is, look, we can see how design works over there. We look at these things over here, whether it's the entire universe or whether it's, animals, human beings, stuff like that, and we say, incredibly well designed, evidence of some sort of intentionality, and we saw this is not a new argument. This is made back in ancient times, right? We saw that with Cicero's on the nature of the gods. The conclusion of this is supposed to be, well, God is some sort of designer then. So not only do we know that God exists, we know that God is in some way a lot like human beings, that there's a similarity that we can count on between human beings who design things and God who designs the whole big ball of wax and everything in it. Even beings that are capable of designing other beings. Now, how does that sound to you? Is that a plausible argument? More plausible than this sort of very abstract argument from causality that Demea was making? This is Cleanthes' argument. And a lot of people make these arguments still today. The entire intelligent design movement is focused around this sort of reasoning. And intelligent design is something very different than creationism. Creationism is like, God created the world in 7 days, and we got to find some way to pack the dinosaurs in with the cavemen, and everything has to happen within this very limited time frame. Intelligent design is willing to say, yeah, you can have evolution, you can have all these other things, but you've got a designer behind the scenes planning everything out, running the show, and that's why we have this incredible complexity that's able to work so well. Do you guys find this plausible? Do you find it implausible? What do you think? Do you agree with this part, right? Do you think you can go from that part to this part? Yeah.
Can you go a step beyond it?
To what? What would be beyond it?
How God get here? Where did he come from?
Yeah, that actually does come up. As Philo says, look, if you want to do this, there's got to be a cause for a cause for a cause business sort of thing, then you got to explain, where did God get this? The way he puts it is, okay, God designs, and how does a designer design? They have ideas in their mind, right? And when you're designing something, there's some sort of order to the ideas in your mind.
Well, there has to be a base, right? So you're designing something off of something you may have seen before.
Yeah. Well, you could imagine something new, but you're right. There has to be some elements of something that you had some prior experience with. And Hume would call those ideas in your mind. How did those ideas get ordered in God's mind? And Cleanthes has a response to this that you might not find entirely convincing. He says, look, you don't have to push it back any further than that. Once you've got that you've got a God designing things, good enough. We don't need to worry about how God got his ideas in his mind. God will take care of that business. Now that may make it less convincing for you when you hear Cleanthes talking like that. Or you might say, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. But that's his response to Philo asking that very same question. Which is, again, a natural question to ask. We just talked about this. We have a tendency to keep on asking why. Cleanthes seems to say, at a certain point, the why, you don't need to answer anymore. Now, let's think about some of the problems with this. So, here's one big problem. Do we really experience design in nature? We experience design in things that we know are designed by human beings. I'm looking around at clothing. Each of the things that you're wearing, unless you have like some thing that was totally random. Like my mom, when I was a kid, used to make our own clothes, and the stuff that she'd make. She was a good seamstress, but it was the '70s, just horrible things. Didn't go with anything. The cuts were always kind of weird, But you guys all have what I'm guessing are store-bought clothes. I do too. All these are the way they are, and we know that they're the way they are because somebody designed them. And if I get too fat, I can have this let out. If I get thin again, I can have this taken in. Somebody is redesigning it, right? Or I can buy some things that fit me better, right? Same thing happens to you as you get bigger, taller. You've had to outgrow a lot of clothes, shoes, things like that. Do we really have a lot of experience about this over here? We don't have experience of God in this sense to begin with, because we didn't see God designing things saying, yeah, the hippopotamus should be about this big, and how many toes should we give it? We don't have any experience of that. We're just presuming that. Do we have experience of design in nature? Not really. So that's kind of a problem. Another big problem that Hume points out through Philo is these arguments from analogy really only work when the things that we're analogizing about are pretty similar to each other. Is a human being pretty similar to God, the way that we normally conceive of God, or God pretty similar to a human being? Or is there such a gulf, such a distance between these two terms that comparisons start to get really shaky, start to break down, start to become no longer certain or even very probable, bless you, but start to become very weak, sort of just mere suggestions? That's a big problem. And where he's going to go with this is where Philo goes. He says, look, you can propose alternate models. You can come up with different notions of how this whole process would work. So let's think about this for a moment. We've got God as designer. And then we've got the universe as designed. Well, let's say that we accept that. Are we going to get the kind of God that we want out of this necessarily? Or could we think of alternate ways of conceiving this? And there's two ways that you can go with this, depending on whether you're going to look at the design part or whether you're going to look at the designer part. Yeah?
Well, could you say that human beings were the designer who designed the notion of God?
Yeah, Hume doesn't go into that in this piece. He treats that in something he calls the natural history of religion, a piece that he didn't publish in his lifetime, because it would have raised a lot of ire that he already had raised against him. But that would be a different sort of issue. That wouldn't really have to do with this so much. That'd be a separate problem that you'd want to treat. The universe is designed. Is the universe, should we understand the universe on the the basis of it being like a bunch of machines or like being one gigantic machine? Or should we perhaps say that the universe, if we want to buy into this sort of thing, is more like perhaps a vegetable undergoing growth, or like an animal undergoing reproduction? That seems just as plausible, this is what Philo is saying, just as plausible, because equally implausible, as the universe being one gigantic machine. So, you know, we know that machines have to have designers, but how do vegetables grow? Do they have to have a designer to come along and, like, you know, okay, carrot, let's you know, tinker around with you. Now we got to add a little bit down here. Yeah.
Well, like, what would you think about, like, genetically altered fruit? Like, you know, like, not
Yeah,
growing in the land.
There you're like tinkering with, like we said, the some of the thing, but the basic structure. A carrot still remains a carrot, right? If it becomes so different than a carrot, we got to call it something else. I mean, even if it like started doing things that we see in cartoons, like the carrot suddenly grows carrot legs and starts becoming a menace and trying to eat us, you know, we would still say I'm being attacked by a giant carrot, wouldn't we? Like we do in cartoons sometimes. But let's say we're not genetically altering these things. Vegetables, you just plant the seed, right? And then it kind of grows by itself. I mean, you got to weed around it if you don't want weeds to get it, and you got to protect it from insects. But for the most part, it's sort of on its own. And don't plants reproduce more or less on their own? They don't even all reproduce by seed, right? How do your lilies reproduce?
Pollination.
Well, they do make little bits of seed, but that's not how they usually spread. How do they tend to spread? Roots, right? They spread their root system out, and a new lily thing pops up here, and after a while it's an independent thing. Rhizomes, we call those. So maybe the universe is more like that. Or maybe it's more like an animal. You know, having all these sort of things going on. The Stoics seemed to think of it that way, didn't they? Back in Cicero's dialogue. So if that's the case, then, you know, you don't need a designer. And I don't remember whether it's Cleanthes or Demea points out, well, you still have to kind of explain the problem of where did that, I think it is Demea, where did that vegetable come from in the first place? He wants to go back to a priori arguments. You know, why does the vegetable grow the way it does? Why do animals reproduce the way they do? But, you know, imagine this for a moment. Imagine that the universe is sort of like a seed from some sort of cosmic tree, and it grows and eventually becomes mature and then produces new little seedlet universes of its own, and they go off and they produce themselves. You don't need a God in that picture, do you? It just sort of happens, right? So you could take the designer out. But let's say we want to go with there being a designer. So this is where Philo brings up what I call a bunch of different models. And these are kind of interesting thoughts to think about. Philo doesn't actually believe these. He's just proposing these as possibilities. And he's saying, look, if you want to say that this design thing is going to work, these are just as plausible as anything else. So in one section he gives 6 of these. So he says, maybe the world is perfect, right? Maybe the world actually is this gigantic, perfect machine, but how do machinists work? Do they actually come up with everything in their head on their own? Anybody have family members who work in tool and die, or in production lines in factories or stuff like that, or designers for anything? No? You guys know what a template is, right? You guys use templates, I think, sometimes in writing. Did your writing instructors give you any templates? No? It's too bad, because they're handy. You know, if you're going to write this kind of paper, here's how to start it, here's how to end it, here's all the guts in between, you know. That's a template. When you have to write a report about something and it's got, you know, fill in this part here, that's giving you a template. It's telling you what to do at what point. We do that when we design things as well. All right, first put the plate down. Now drill the holes in it. Now put that plate on top of this plate. Now put a bolt through it. You guys have followed templates when you followed instructions, putting things together, right? Toys, later on it's going to become Ikea things, you know. People love Ikea, apparently. I'm not so big on it myself, but you know, I know a lot of people who are really impressed with it. So maybe the world is like that. Why do we have to think of God as being like this, you know, super great designer? Why couldn't he just have gotten a template from some other place and applied it, and here's our world? Maybe there was another world that, you know, turned out to be like, you know, the best practices world, and all the gods say, yeah, that's the kind of world we're going to make. Here we go. I've got it. Now I'll just put it together, follow the instructions. Hippos go over here, giraffes go over here. Don't put the monkeys right next to the lions, because they'll eat it, you know, there won't be any monkeys left after a while. Palm trees go here. Okay, I've got it all set up. Isn't that plausible? Isn't that equally plausible as a God who actually like designed every single thing by himself? When you think about, you know, hobby people who are into model trains. Some of them get really, really into those dioramas. Do they make every single thing by themselves, or do they sometimes copy from other places? And here's another, so that's the first model. Maybe, here's another one. Maybe this world is the last world in a whole bunch of trials, and this turns out to be the best of the worlds that was made, because the other ones were all screwed up in some ways. And so God would make them, and then after he'd like look at them for a while and he'd be like, nah, let me erase and start again. You know, like when you're writing a paper, in the old-fashioned days, you know, you all do it on your computer now, so you just delete, right? But in the old-fashioned days, you type it on a typewriter, you look at it, you'd be like, nah, that's crap, and you ball it up, throw it away. And you've seen movies where like somebody's got like a whole trash can and it's full of all sorts of balled up attempts. Maybe this is the one that made it through. So the design in it is just a function of God having honed his skills over a while. Maybe this world wasn't designed by a God. Maybe it was designed by a whole committee of gods or team. I mean, you guys don't like group projects, I know, right? How many of you like group projects? You like group projects? You were in the military, though, so you actually have some experience with groups that actually work, right? Most students don't like group projects because some of the students slack off and parts don't always fit together. But when you actually have experience of being on a team that actually everybody's on the same page, it's kind of fun. It's enjoyable. And I hope that in your careers that are coming up, you will have better experiences with doing group projects, because it can be quite useful. And sometimes people bring more and more of the process. Well, if that's the case, though, then we're no longer talking about a God who's perfect. We're talking about a whole bunch of gods, each of whom contributes a little thing. That could bring up all sorts of interesting issues. He brings up another problem that came from the Greeks. Maybe the gods are so much like human beings that they actually reproduce sexually. Maybe some of the things in the world are a product of the gods getting it on with various parts of the cosmos or each other. You know, if you look at the old Egyptian cosmologies or some of the Greek ones or various things, or, you know, you could pick other things like, you know, Norse mythology. One of the gods, I forget which one, kills this giant and then makes parts of the earth out of the giant. You know, you could come up with all sorts of examples like this. Model 5, maybe this world is actually the first effort by some young god who's trying his best but isn't very skilled yet, and that's why there's all the problems that we encounter. Maybe some of the other gods even make fun of his project. You know, he's sort of like the kid who's not very good in the science fair. That's a possibility. You look sad because of that idea. Poor little godlet, you know. Or maybe, I mentioned this before, maybe it's a very old god who is actually way past his prime and was senile, and after he made this world, he died. And the world has just sort of kept going on. Usually gods would stay more involved with and stay on top of their projects, but this god just wasn't with it, and after he died, the world just kept going on as it is, and that's why things are the way they are. Isn't any one of these models just as plausible as the model that is being put forward by Cleanthes? Yeah.
I'd say yes, all except for the last one, because if you get to the concept of God, then you have to try and throw in there, how does God die?
Yeah. I mean, the gods die in some mythologies. Like the Norse mythology, they're all going to die except for just a few at the very end in Ragnarok. And the Babylonian mythologies, they kill each other. Man is actually made in the Enuma Elish out of the blood of, I forget his name, one of the gods who was a big troublemaker. So they kill him, and the gods are like, yeah, we need some people to serve us, because this thing of us serving each other is not going to fly anymore. Clearly, this leads to all sorts of problems. Let's create a race to serve us. So they take the blood of this god and mix it together with dirt, and then you got human beings. So there's you can conceive of gods dying, because people have thought of that. Maybe that's too anthropomorphical a conception. Let me talk about one other thing, then we'll finish up. Because I just brought up that word, anthropomorphism. Now, Demea accuses Cleanthes of trying to make God too much like human beings. And he says, really, we can't know very much about God. Cleanthes says, no, God is very much like human beings that we experience. That's why we can, in fact, know things about God. Cleanthes is going to go even further. And he is actually going to say, in this case, that God is not perfect, infinite, simple. The perfect, all-powerful follows from that as well. He says God's not all-powerful. There's evil in the world, in part because God couldn't prevent all of it. If you start making God more and more like a human being, if your conception of God is like that, then you're probably going to have to go to something like this. Cleanthes says if we want to understand how God thinks, we can't say that God's mind is completely simple, because we have no way to understand that, what that means. I mean, think about your minds. You have all sorts of ideas. They change over time. Your ideas kind of jar with each other or coincide with each other. Supposedly, according to traditional Christian theology, God's mind is so totally simple that he sees past, present, and future all at the same time. Remember when we looked at Augustine, it was that sort of thing. How can that even make sense, Cleanthes is saying? God's mind must be much more like our minds. So God could undergo change. God would not be perfect. God could actually get better or perhaps get worse. God would not have infinite power, infinite knowledge. This is a very interesting conception of God. There are some people out there who have sort of run with this idea. It's not a majority conception, is it? Most people, when they want to say, God exists, they want it to be an infinite, perfect, completely simple God, there from all eternity and all that. But then you have a hard time explaining things like, well, why is there evil in the world then? This traditional problem of evil that Philo will bring up and Cleanthes will try to deal with. Cleanthes he can get out of that just by saying, well, God's not perfect. He's really good, just not perfect. So the world is pretty good, but not as good as it could be if God was even more powerful. But if God was more powerful, we would be less able to understand what God is, less able to make sense out of this, and less able to be sure that there is such a God. You can tell Demea doesn't really like this idea. You can tell Philo doesn't buy it either. So, that's probably a good sign that Hume himself doesn't buy this idea, but he puts it in the mouth of one of his interlocutors because it's where Cleanthes' ideas ultimately lead. So he puts you in a lot of dilemmas in this. If you're going to buy these starting points, well, that's going to lead here. If you're going to buy these starting points, that's going to lead here. If you're going to buy these, that leads here. And none of these are alternatives that a traditional Christian theist could be happy with. So the ultimate conclusion for Hume's dialogues on natural religion, which Hume himself doesn't spell out, is that none of these arguments are actually going to work. None of these traditional ways of understanding things are going to be reliable. Very rhetorically powerful way of putting it together. Again, up to you whether you buy this stuff or not. I think there's a lot of gaps in Hume's own reasoning about this sort of thing, but very powerful challenge to the very notion of being able to prove anything about God. So, have a good weekend.